Hi. Misha, can you hear me?
Hello. Yes, I
Hey,
can, loud and clear.
Magnolia. Misha, can you hear me? Polaris and
Hello.
Shelby.
Yes, I can, loud and clear.
Magnolia. Misha, can you hear me? Polaris and Shelby.
Ooh, there is a bit of echo coming in from your computer. That might be from the streams.
Are we good?
Yes, that is good.
Thank you so much for being here, Misha. Just to give a little intro on Misha. Misha, you've been active in the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong since 2014, the Umbrella Revolution, and I know that now you're focusing most of your time on providing international coverage and translations of the protests through your social media accounts you run with a team at HKZ.Global. It's a really great platform, and it's geared to foreigners interested in the movement and relevant news coming out of it. Reached out to you for obvious reasons here in the States, seeing that Black Lives Matter movement is becoming front and center of everything that's going on, and there's activists rising. Some of them are younger and they don't have direct experience, and some are very experienced. And so we wanted to reach out to our comrades in Hong Kong. Thanks for being here. I guess so that people understand, why don't you give us an overview of what got you to where you're at now?
Yeah, first of all, it's an honor to be here. Thank you to Leveler and Shipping for the invite. We'd also like to say that we stand in solidarity with everyone who is in support of the Black Lives Matter movement. We hope that you continue to fight for your cause. Just to get everyone up to date on what's been happening in Hong Kong, since June, there has been a pro-democracy movement that was triggered by an extradition law proposed by the government. And most of the people in Hong Kong were afraid of losing their freedoms of speech, freedoms of creativity, and their freedoms of their rights in general to an overbearing Chinese communist regime. In general, there have been big marches since the start. There were 1 million people and then consecutively 2 million people out on the streets at one point. Over the past sort of year or so, a few weeks ago was just the first year anniversary. Over the past year or so, there have been an overarching 5 demands, which include retraction of the bill, which has been done actually. Second one being release of arrested protesters. Third, retraction of the riot classifications on a specific date. A full independent inquiry into the Hong Kong police force. This is particularly important as there have been many, many cases of police brutality against Hong Kong protesters for the pro-democracy movement. And I'm sure everyone can relate. And finally, what I believe is the most important demand is true universal suffrage in Hong Kong, and that is something that we have been vying for since 2014. In the recent months, protests have been hindered by the coronavirus. The US has been hit very hard with it. My heart is with everyone there. I hope everyone's doing well. Our government, unfortunately, the Hong Kong government has been using the social distancing rules as an excuse to stop people from gathering. And even though there have been minimal cases in Hong Kong, however, people are starting to realize that this is just an excuse. And I'm not sure if everyone is familiar. There has been a national security law proposed by China's Congress, and that has been raising a lot of international awareness lately. People are afraid that Hong Kong's freedoms will be further oppressed, and awareness of the movement and protest are picking back up because people are starting to realize, hey, the government's just using social distancing and the coronavirus as an excuse. and there are just more international implications with this national security law going on. Yep, and that's about where where Hong Kong is. There are a few large protests lined up, but I reckon it would be good for us to keep the dates sort of concealed.
Sure, absolutely. Um, so I guess segueing off of keeping the dates concealed, I'm curious to know if the media has been an ally in any way, and how.
Yeah, certainly. Personally, and as a general consensus, we believe that media outlets have been an essential ally. It is important to note that the ones that are independent and non-government corporation-funded organizations or media outlets are especially important because they have no incentive to produce biased news. Um, to my understanding, they act as a fourth power or fourth estate, aside from the executive, legislative, and judicial power. What that basically means is that they have the power to ensure transparency in the government, and that they do have power to sort of expose things that are going wrong in the government or dodgy dealings that may be going on. They also have the power to shape public perception as they can choose what to show to the public. In general, I think most media outlets are an ally of freedom of the protests and pro democracy movements in Hong Kong, at least. But it is really important to recognize which media outlets have state affiliations or ulterior motives. To my understanding, a lot of major media outlets in the US have affiliations with large corporations or media tycoons. Uh, Correct me if I'm wrong, Alessandra.
Absolutely correct. It's affable here. You have
Yep.
conservative mainstream media and the neoliberal mainstream media, and they're both telling drastically different stories. And I don't know if there's a crumb of truth in either of them. Um, so
Yeah.
it's
So
definitely
yeah, it is really important.
uh,
Yeah, it is definitely really important to recognize which types of media outlets have affiliations or have possibilities of being biased. And in the end, it is up to your individual discretion as to what is true and what is not. In Hong Kong, the police have actively, or segueing back to how media is our ally, the police have actively oppressed media coverage, and members of the press have been arrested. They have been constantly pushed away from arrested protesters, from the scenes where things are happening. And the police are claiming that, oh, you guys, media, you're in the way of police doing work. Uh, Most significantly, there has been an incident on the 31st of August in 2019 where a metro station was raided by police special task force, and the last media coverage of it were people being pepper sprayed inside a train, inside a platform. It was quite shocking and um, quite a sight to see, unfortunately. And in the end, when there were hurt people in the station, the police pushed media out of the station, and there was no media coverage of what happened in the station for about 3 to 4 hours. And since then, because there has been no transparency and there has been no sort of unbiased, authoritative source of information to report what's going on, there have been plenty of rumors, controversies that have spread, and then that has been always a point of controversy and misinformation. Up till now, there has been no truth. Uh, so, going back to the question, it is really important to be aware of members of the press, even in the protests. In the early stages, a lot of Hong Kongers looked out for press members, providing them with a protective equipment from crowd dispersal um, methods, and they also provide a lot of cover for the press, just so that this transparency of information and truth was protected.
Thank you. I think we had our real future dystopian moment on, I think it was day 2 in Minneapolis. A CNN crew was arrested on live television. It was extremely jarring, I think, to everybody to see that. The environment in which they were filming, they were in the street on the front line, there was smoke and rubble, and they did get arrested on live TV. And I do believe that that was sort of a wake-up call for maybe some people who were supportive of the movement, but didn't quite understand how much information is trying to be suppressed right now.
Yeah, definitely. I realize that I've kind of forgotten to mention that obviously the media can also be your enemy, because obviously media can show both sides, and they have the choice to show whatever they want. In China, in Hong Kong, there have been cases of state-affiliated or state-controlled media corporations spreading, let's say, not so accurate and not so true news about the protests in Hong Kong and in China, just as a cover-up to information and to diminish the value of the protesters, which include sometimes showing peaceful protests as violent clashes, definitely misinterpreting or misusing the demands that the protesters have suggested in a harmful way when we didn't mean that. And it just really is important to be aware of that, and that it is in the end up to the individual to determine what is true and what is not. And there is a lot of research and information behind that that needs to be done.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely been eye-opening for me being on the ground in New York and then talking to people who aren't here and trying to garner their understanding of what's going on here. It predominantly goes back to riots and looting and riots and looting. And it's just so different than what the reality is here. And it's similarly, many peaceful protests are being made to seem unpeaceful by both sides, honestly. So you start to wonder, like, what is the end game for either side when you have the left side of things that seem to be pro the movement, and then the right side is obviously very dancing around, you know, dog whistling in so many different
Yep.
ways, and then blatantly as well. I watched a clip from Tucker Carlson, who is just an instigator beyond. And the picture that they paint is that there's like roving Antifa anarchist packs with Molotov cocktails just like waiting to tear down a statue or light a fire, or, you know, they're building this narrative that the people just want violent anarchy.
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting because I'm sure you guys are getting a lot of news coverage on the movements, and at the same time, the movement, from my perspective, because I'm currently not in the US, and the movement from my perspective is that there hasn't been much coverage on it lately because there has been so much other things going on, and it is important to garner that. It is important to realize that even though you may be getting a lot of attention locally, there isn't as much international attention, and most of it will only be going to the flashy scenes and the violent protests. And while I feel like that is an important part of a movement, that shouldn't be everything in a movement.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my father lives in South America, and his understanding of what's happening here is also sort of very different than what's actually happening. And they have their own movement in Brazil that's sort of taking a lot of traction right now, specifically around people who live and work in homes. There's a lot of class disparity in Brazil. It's really terrible there. Um, but you know, I think we forget that here sometimes, that what's going on in our country is it's not necessarily portrayed in the same way. From I on a very sort of hyperbolic level, there's a quote, I can't remember who it's from, but it's that the U.S. is impenetrable, like as a country, to attack because every single person in America has a gun. Like, that's one understanding of how, like, what's going on in this country, which also it has like some truth to it. We do have a lot of guns here, but clearly not everyone has one. So that's like a very sort of dramatic, like, no one could ever attack the US because all the citizens are armed. Like
Yeah,
some crazy
definitely.
blanket statement that just like, that's how we're perceived by some. Um, oh, actually, this is a perfect opportunity to ask you. Uh, so I wanted to ask you about protest tourism. The reason I want to ask, just to give you a little context, is a friend of mine who is very active in the Black Lives Matter movement traveled to Hong Kong last year, and the protests started to get sort of mainstream international coverage. Um, and it was really interesting seeing him posting on social media of what was happening in Hong Kong because he was there. Um, I wanted to give you context because I feel like that's a strange question. Like, what's up with protest tourism? The real question is protest tourism beneficial in some regards? Like using those additional bodies of people who maybe aren't in it every day, but are kind of like trying to help in some ancillary way.
In my opinion, and from my experience out in the protests, cases of protest tourism are quite rare, and if they were present, most people would sort of retreat or get away from the protest once they got violent because they didn't exactly understand, one, the geography of the place, and two, they're not sure where it's going to go. So these unsure sort of factors sort of dissuade them from continuing to be at a protest. However, we do always benefit from extra people, especially the peaceful movement, because it is a show of solidarity and it is a show of how many people support your cause. So personally, I don't think protest tourism is a bad thing, and most of the time, authoritarian regimes do not want international sort of attention. So international sort of foreigners in a country are generally a bit more protected and safe from these regimes, just because the international implications of detaining a foreigner, detaining someone who's not in your country, as or not from your country, as we can see with the hostage situation or the situation in China and Canada with the two sort of the two countries fighting for legal power with the detainment of citizens. Um, However, even the most peaceful of rallies can face violent oppression. You can be doing nothing, and authoritarian forces will just come and disperse the crowd just because they don't like you or because they've received orders from someone. We do appreciate the extra support of people coming out to the protests, but it really is important to ensure that you know what you're signing up for and the risk that entails. And ultimately, I feel like a freedom or human rights movement has to be done from the people who are being oppressed, or else there really is not much point to that movement.
Absolutely. I was just thinking about the other side of protest tourism, which is sort of
Hello,
um,
Alessandra. I can't exactly hear you right now.
can you hear me? Did I lose you?
No.
Can't hear me? About now? Oh, oh.
No, I'm not getting any audio from you, unfortunately.
Maybe we want Misha to quickly sign out and back in.
Okay, could you try again?
Are you there?
Yep, hello. Yes, I can hear you now.
Hi. Okay. What I was saying is I have some friends in Minneapolis who very early on were reporting that there were this right wing group that was sort of coming in, blending in with the crowd, and then causing intentional chaos and confusion in order to essentially tarnish the Black Lives Matter movement. And that was a really strange sort of development that you forget because you have people standing in solidarity, fighting to end systemic racism, and that is such a big undertaking that it's easy to forget that there are lots of co-opters who want to come in for their own reasons and take over. And I feel that that actually has happened in some capacity. And it happened early on, and it really solidified the way the media portrayed everything that was happening because of these early sort of agitators that were causing destruction that was completely unrelated to the movement. So there's like that side of the protest tourism too. Even here in New York, it's interesting to see a lot of people coming from out of state to march here because whatever's going on where they live maybe isn't as uh, as noisy.
Yeah, definitely. Can you guys still hear me? Yeah, definitely. Because, as you were saying, Alessandra, there are people who just go into the protests and instigate sort of a more violent and emotional response from the crowd. Uh, Obviously, we like to call them agent provocateurs, but at the same time, they're really, really hard to prove because every single force, police force, or sort of police organization will deny the existence of agent provocateurs. And yet, at the same time, there has been a lot of proof in Hong Kong of policemen dressing up as protesters. Those they have been quote unquote taken onto police cars, but these protesters work together with the police force to identify the protesters in the peaceful protesters, and as a form of oppression, take them away as a fear tactic. And I think that is a point that is really important and for everyone to be aware of. That was the downfall of a few big protests in Hong Kong, but that is something I can come back to later.
Oh, I'd love to talk about that. There's a lot of concern here, and sort of infighting sometimes that happens, because a lot of people are kind of coming out of the woodwork, and it's like, well, organizers are kind of maybe not trusting other organizers because they've been exposed as someone who's working with the police or various other reasons not to trust them. So I'd love to hear an example of how there was like spy detection in the ranks that led to people, shunning someone.
Generally, organizers haven't been shunned too much, but individuals in the crowd have been guessed or have been under sort of scrutiny of whether they are agent provocateurs. The general sort of answer to this, or in Hong Kong at least, is that to make sure what the goal of that protest is it a peaceful one? Is it a show of force? I think, and just be aware of people in the crowd who are suspicious. A lot of times, something that I've noticed is that they will wear communications equipment, and at the same time, the agent provocateurs or people in the crowd, undercover agents in the protests, are pretty recognizable. I think an awareness of that is really important, and to not fall into their traps of instigating emotion and sort of a violent clash. That is quite important. And in terms of organizers being shunned, I mentioned that there weren't any cases of that. This is because generally organizers are public figures or well-known activists in the past. For example, there were people who came out in 2014 and they're well known, and organizations that they have been under or they have been involved in have come out to organize these protests, and there's your sort of authority behind it. But in general, it is a leaderless movement, and there isn't exactly one person they can sort of shut down or silence, because they know even if you silence that person, more people will come out, and that's a really important point in the movement.
What is like generally the cadence? Because this is so sustained over such a long period of time. Who's sort of sparking larger actions, and what happens when those are sparked? Does it last for weeks? Does it last for days? How does that work?
Yeah. Generally, it really depends on the time period. The protests, the movement has been going on for about a year now. In general, it really depends on the time period because, as you know, the coronavirus put a stop to everything pretty much because everyone was stuck at home. So everything out on the streets was basically put on a standstill, but people were still doing things online. But when the protest first began, it was a majorly sort of responsive movement to the things that were happening around. Perhaps it was a government sort of press release, or maybe it was an action a policeman had done. That's something that we tend to not want to follow, because it is a very reactive type of protest, and we'd rather be more proactive. That's something that Hong Kongers, the protesters in Hong Kong, need to learn as well, I feel. But when the protests first began, there were basically protests every single day, and now they're starting to come back up, as I mentioned, because of the national security law that's been proposed, and everything is getting a bit more international attention.
Well, so I mean, it's sparked by something real. And then maybe it is able to find sustainability because of that. And then, so, I mean, here it's reactionary, right? And now you have people trying to create something sustainable out of reactionary large movement. So it would you say that certain triggers that are external are causing the mobilization to begin, and then it begins to sustain itself because people get organized in that moment of reactive mobilization?
Yeah, definitely. Something I forgot to mention was that protests generally also spring up on important dates. For example, Hong Kong has the handover from the UK back to China on the 1st of July, so you can definitely expect something then. Obviously, it's coming up, so a lot of people are planning for things for that. Also, on the 4th of June, which was the day of the Tiananmen massacre, where China basically ran a bunch of tanks into students in 1984. Actually, that's 1989, sorry. 1989 Tiananmen massacre anniversary. And there's a commemorative sort of gathering that's always peaceful in basically the Hyde Park of Hong Kong that is held every single year, and that's really important. And that's when sort of the protest spring up. But a common concept in Hong Kong is that resistance or revolution should be incorporated into daily life. For example, there shouldn't be a set date of protest because there is so much you can do in outside of the protest. Figure out which corporations truly support the movement, whether it be the Black Lives Matter movement or the Hong Kong pro-democracy movement. Always be aware of opportunities to promote or participate in a protest. Promotion is actually extra important, as the monopoly of big media corporations make it hard for different sort of ways to promote to show up. And I feel like the constant idea of resistance is much more powerful than a one-off showing up to a protest. And that is an idea a lot of human rights fighters in the world should be aware of.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a budget meeting coming up soon here in New York, and so now there's an Occupy protest, and I could be wrong, but I think that that is a demand on the Occupy protest at City Hall, which is to cut $3 billion instead of $1 billion from the NYPD budget. I think that's what it is. I think that's what the demand is, or at least that's what I've seen. So it's nice to see that there is a demand being made. But yeah, I mean, people have been camped out for 2 or 3 days now in advance of this budget meeting that will be happening at City Hall, which is pretty great. And there's been lots of folks trying to bring supplies down and make sure that everyone who is occupying that space is being taken care of. I guess that made me think of a question. How long do you think it took to organize a front line where resources and info traveled back and forth with a minimal impact, whether that's environmental or technological? Like how did that become achieved?
Personally, I think even from the first day, it was an individual decision of every single protester, every single frontliner to be on the front lines, and that is how everything kind of got organized. And the people who sort of didn't want to be on the front lines or wanted to take more of a backstage role per se, they just donated whatever they could to resource stations, and this was all from 2014. I guess that movement sort of, it was the Occupy movement, similar to what you guys are having in New York right now. And it didn't take long. I'd say resource stations started coming up within the week. And yeah, and up till now, as the protests have become a bit more mobilized, there has been resource, we call them chains, but it's basically just a human chain passing on resources, equipment, food to the protests. And it all really depends on whether it's a mobilized sort of movement or is it an Occupy sort of single place. In the end, it is really down to individual motivation, and everybody contributes what they can. In terms of concealment of footprints, encrypted messaging programs have been a very important part of the movement. Telegram is one of them, even though personally I feel like it is very easy for police to infiltrate. So organization of movement, it shouldn't be done there, and it should be used as an information sharing platform instead of a sort of organization app. It is better to use better encrypted apps or private channels to do that. In terms of the environmental sort of concealment, black clothing, we call it black bloc in Hong Kong. It will help maintain anonymity on the front lines and sort of avoid avoid sort of further action from the police because you have participated in these movements, because it does get harder to identify you if you're in black clothing and a black mask, and that is really important.
Thank you. Have you guys been having any internet problems? Like, are you using mesh networks or anything? Or for, obviously when you're communicating?
Are you referring to raising money through mesh networks or just communicating in general?
Oh, no. Well, that I'm curious to know. I definitely am curious to know if you are raising money and how you're doing it in a way that is not making anyone vulnerable. But the internet in general, has there been any blockages where you've needed to get onto another network? I'll give you an example here. This is sort of like, it's just a use case that doesn't necessarily exist, but it's a thought. If our internet went down here, there are mesh networks in New York City that could run internet locally so that people could stay on a different grid if there were something like a spectrum outage. I mean, we have Telegram's been down a lot, but I think that's a Telegram issue.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's actually a really good idea by you guys. I haven't experienced any usage of mesh networks. I understand what you guys are talking about. That is something that we could learn from you guys, as demonstrated. There's a lot of things we can learn from each other. But in general, there hasn't been a sort of internet outage or internet issues while we've been out on the protests. In terms of internet, everything's pretty smooth. The only thing we've had is sort of corporations like Facebook and WhatsApp and Instagram, even, they're banning a lot of these more radical accounts and news, and sort of spreading a bit of misinformation in
They're all
general.
owned by the same. It's all the same group.
Yeah, exactly. They're all owned by Facebook. That is exactly why this is happening. But yeah, the only issue with internet is that. But in terms of like internet access and internet going down, we haven't had too much of that, except for the Reddit forum, or the equivalent of the Reddit forum of Reddit in Hong Kong, going down for a while, because that's also where a lot of the crowdsourced organized protests have been organized. So that is an issue that we've had, but we've had ways to go through that, probably through different platforms.
Yeah, where I think there's this mass adoption here of encrypted messaging apps. So it's really funny to see alerts. I'll get an alert. We use Signal a lot. So I'll get a Signal alert that's like, so-and-so is now on Signal. And I'm like, what the hell are they doing on Signal? But there has been a mass adoption of people trying to figure out other ways to communicate, because I think that there is, there's like this mounting pressure and paranoia around surveillance and the how surveillance is affected by the commodification of behaviors and how corporations are using that. And I think there's just so much going on at the same time right now that people are rejecting en masse the idea that you can safely communicate through something like a Facebook or a WhatsApp or Instagram, and really adopting these other channels of communication that are supposed to be safe. But really, I mean, do we know if they are? I don't know. Maybe someone. I don't know anything about technology. I'm just like, okay, yeah. You said to download Signal, so that's what I'm doing.
Yeah, definitely. I think stuff done through messaging apps and just apps in general through the internet, they always run the risk of being intercepted, of being monitored. China is a massive culprit of internet censorship, of pretty much anything that's negative to the Communist Party. That's why I feel like in general it is very important to organize the movement on the ground instead of through these internet messaging apps, because that's where you truly know what's going on and the real situation that's there, and you're truly devoid of misinformation if you don't use those apps.
That's super helpful. So we have a few more minutes. I wanted to ask you about Hong Kong. I'm curious to know where you see the movement going and how long you foresee it sustaining.
Yep. In my opinion, it's obviously escalated to an international scale, along with because of the national security law. There are so many implications internationally, because Hong Kong in general has been used as like a bridge between the US and China, because there has been because of the linked rates between the Hong Kong dollar and the US, and Hong Kong's close affiliation with China means that there's sort of like an ATM card. Hong Kong is sort of like an ATM card, and China can sort of draw foreign currency into the country through Hong Kong. With the national security law, the US is considering its relations with Hong Kong, and there will be a lot of sort of bills and amendments to the relationship between the two places. Hong Kong in general, I feel like, is stuck in the middle because this is such an international scale. And in between the two global superpowers, there isn't much Hong Kong can do on an international scale. Obviously, there is a lot of things to do in or locally. But yes, how long? Sorry. In terms of how long I see this going, I think it's until people are silenced completely, or that we see either the fall of the Communist Party or Hong Kong gains autonomy in some form or shape.
Is there anything that you think that organizers in the States who might listen to this should know from your own experience? Anything?
Yeah, first of all, it's important to maintain a clear flow of information from all sources, making sure they're not biased and sourced well. Misinformation was a massive downfall in some of the big protests. Um, say also, this was a point I mentioned before, be careful of agent provocateurs. They will intentionally rile up protesters to the point where the protest will lose its focus and everyone kind of forgets what they were there for, as we can see with all the looting that happened at the start of the movement. It turned out in the end that the focus was lost and everything was put onto the riots and looting and original cause.
I think does serve a purpose, but the hard part is, how do you sort of move without creating propaganda for the enemy, right? So that became media propaganda against the movement. Then there are many instances where people marching here, maybe there was an organizer here who was leading really powerful marches and protests, and then was seen interacting with a police officer, and that moment that happened created like a lot of propaganda that would essentially hurt the movement to some folks or their opinion. But yeah, I mean, it's hard to. I just wanted to interject about the looting, because while it does create propaganda, I also see why it is, like sometimes burning the whole shit down, it's a point across.
Yeah, definitely. And I definitely agree with that. It is these shocking, sort of flashy scenes that garner the most international attention. And that will lead to people thinking about what the motive behind this is. And I'm sure that in the beginning, there were good intentions for everything to happen. And it was just because these voices were oppressed for so long, there had to be sort of a sparking point and an incident for them to release or express their opinions.
I mean, intention or no intention, the idea that like an act of violence perpetrated against something or someone, such as a police station burning down, it brings awareness acutely to the underlying objective violence that is going on every single day. So systemic racism being an objective violence that really props up the American capitalist society, those acts of violence, like George Floyd being heinously murdered in the street, that act of violence, it showed the larger objective violence that is going on, that is unacceptable.
Yeah, definitely. And as like a sort of conclusion, as cliche as it may be, I think it's important to sort of stay united towards the common goal. recognize that there are a lot of different ways to achieve a goal, whether it be through a show of force or a peaceful protest. And sometimes, most of the time, all of them are needed, and it is a combined effort of external, internal, and like peaceful and violent factors, and it just is, all of them are needed to achieve the goal that you guys want.
Well, I really appreciate you taking this time and your generosity of spirit here for an hour. I know there's a time difference where you are, so I guess I'm just trying to think if there's anything else. Do you think there's ways activists and organizers in different countries can help one another?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's really important that, one, there's an overarching common goal between not just local activists, but also international ones. In Hong Kong, obviously, our ultimate goal is true universal suffrage, and we hope that people abroad know that as well. Something that was really important, or that was really significant to us, was collaborating and synchronizing protest timings across the world. Global events generally will raise more awareness and cause more ripples than just a singular local one. For example, last year in September, there was an international anti-authoritarian regime rally, and that was a global rally across more than 10 countries. And it was just all to raise awareness of authoritarianism and, in general, the acts of the Chinese Communist Party. And in general, just human rights activists need to unite to sort of maintain this movement and overarching goal. One sort of thing that's been very iconic of the Hong Kong protests is the concept. Sorry, this is a bit sort of off topic, but is the concept of be water. Basically, quoted directly from Bruce Lee. Be water, it basically entails that we have to be flexible and versatile like water. And at the same time, water can also be hard, like be strong, like ice. And it can also be mist and in the form of vapor. It's just important to recognize which situations must you stand strong and hold your ground, and which situations is it possible to sort of retreat and maybe come back and fight another day. It just depends on the situation, and that's just a really important concept that we've held ever since the start of the movement.
All right, so let's leave it there. Thank you so much. Be water. That's the number one takeaway.
Yeah, definitely, and it's been an honor speaking to you guys as well. Here's to the success of both the movements, and hopefully we'll be able to maybe collaborate in the future again.
All right, thank you so much, Misha.